This man never returned after diving into a cave. However, years later, the police uncovered a terrifying truth hidden behind his disappearance. Beneath the dark, icy waters of Lake Michigan, where visibility was nearly non-existent, the professional divers descended with powerful floodlights, sweeping through the depths in search of Martin. At first, they expected to find nothing more than submerged rocks, tangled weeds, or perhaps the wreckage of an old boat. But what they discovered left them speechless. About 100 feet below the surface, nestled within a partially collapsed underwater cave, they found something eerie: Martin's diving gear, neatly placed on a flat rock as if he had deliberately removed it. But there was no sign of his body. The cave itself was unnatural in shape, almost as if it had been carved by human hands. Even stranger, the divers noticed markings on the cave walls, symbols that resembled an ancient script, completely out of place in the lake's depths. Fearing the worst but desperate for answers, Martin's parents turned to experts in underwater archaeology. When a team of specialists examined the site, they uncovered an even more chilling truth. The cave wasn't just a random formation, it was an entrance. An entrance to something hidden beneath the lake. Historical records revealed a disturbing legend about a secret underground passage beneath Lake Michigan, said to have been used centuries ago by an unknown civilization. Some theories suggested it connected to the infamous Michigan Triangular region, known for mysterious disappearances, much like the Bermuda Triangle. Others speculated that it was the remnants of a forgotten settlement lost to time. As the investigation continued, the divers pushed deeper into the passage. What they found sent a shiver down their spines. The narrow tunnel led to a vast, submerged chamber, where the walls were covered in more of those ancient symbols. In the center of the chamber was something that defied explanation: a massive stone altar, covered in carvings of humanoid figures with elongated limbs and hollow, empty eyes. And then they saw it, a shadowy figure, motionless, kneeling before the altar. It was Martin, or at least, what was left of him. His body was perfectly preserved, almost as if frozen in time, his face locked in an expression of pure terror. His hands were pressed against the altar, and around him, the water felt eerily still, as if something was watching, waiting. The team quickly snapped photos and retrieved as much evidence as they could before fear got the best of them. They swam back up, their hearts pounding, as the darkness of the cave seemed to stretch endlessly behind them. When they surfaced, they reported their findings to the authorities, but what happened next was even more bizarre. Within hours, government officials arrived, confiscating all the divers' equipment, photos, and research. They were warned to never speak of what they had seen. The site was marked as a restricted zone, and any further exploration was strictly forbidden. Martin's parents were left without answers. The official report simply stated that Martin had drowned due to reckless diving. But those who had seen the truth knew better. Something ancient lurked beneath Lake Michigan, something that should never have been disturbed. And Martin, he hadn't just disappeared. He had been taken. The truth of what lay beneath Lake Michigan remained buried both literally and figuratively. The government's swift intervention ensured that no further investigation took place, and the divers who had witnessed the horror were forced into silence. But Martin's parents refused to accept the official explanation. They knew their son hadn't simply drowned. Something had happened to him down there, something beyond human comprehension. Desperate for answers, Martin's father, Richard, began searching for anyone who might know more about the strange symbols found in the underwater cave. His research led him down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories, ancient legends, and forbidden knowledge. Eventually, he stumbled upon an obscure historian named Dr. Elias Harrow, a man who had spent decades studying lost civilizations and unexplained phenomena surrounding the Great Lakes. When Richard showed Dr. Harrow the few photos he had managed to recover before the authorities seized the evidence, the historian's face went pale. He immediately recognized the symbols. This isn't just an ancient script," Harrow muttered, tracing his fingers over the markings. "It's a warning. According to Harrow, the symbols belonged to a civilization so old that it predated even the indigenous tribes of North America. This lost society was said to have built great structures beneath the lake, temples dedicated to unseen deities. Legend spoke of a ritual, an offering made to appease the ones below. These beings, neither human nor entirely physical, existed outside of time itself. They demanded a sacrifice of soul to replace the last one taken. The most disturbing part, the rituals never stopped. Every few decades, someone went missing in that exact area, their bodies never found. And those who did return weren't the same. Your son wasn't just lost, Richard, Harrow whispered. He was chosen. A chilling realization settled over Richard. If what Harrow said was true, then Martin's fate was not just a tragic accident, it was part of something far more sinister. But there was one lingering question that gnawed at him. Was Martin truly gone, or was he still down there, waiting? Determined to uncover the truth once and for all, Richard assembled a team-man underground group of rogue divers, conspiracy theorists, and deep-sea explorers who weren't afraid to defy government restrictions. Their goal was simple: return to the cave, document everything, and, if possible, bring Martin back. Under the cover of night, they launched their expedition. Armed with high-powered diving gear, sonar technology, and underwater drones, they descended into the abyss where Martin had vanished. The deeper they went, the more the lake seemed to resist them. Equipment malfunctioned, lights flickered. Some divers swore they heard whispers, distorted voices carried through the water. Then, as they approached the cave's entrance, the temperature plummeted. The water around them became unnaturally still. It was as if the lake itself was holding its breath. They pushed forward. Inside the cave, everything was just as the original divers had described: the eerie carvings, the unsettling altar. But this time, there was something new. A trail of disturbed sediment led deeper into the chamber, as if something or someone had moved. Then their cameras picked up movement. At the far end of the chamber, where the darkness swallowed their lights, a figure stood motionless. It was Martin ... but something was wrong. His body was rigid, unnaturally still, yet his eyes wide and unblinking seemed to follow them. His skin, once normal, had taken on a strange, translucent hue, as if he had been submerged for centuries. The divers hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Then Martin moved. His head twitched slightly, his mouth opening ever so slightly. A single, garbled word bubbled from his lips. Run! The water around them erupted into chaos. Shadows twisted and coiled through the cavern, moving with impossible speed. The divers screamed through their radios as an unseen force pulled at them, dragging them toward the altar. Some tried to swim away, but it was as if the lake itself had come alive, clutching them in an inescapable grip. Richard, refusing to abandon his son, fought against the currents, reaching out toward Martin. Their hands nearly touched, and for a brief moment, he saw something deep within Martin's eyes. A reflection of something vast and ancient, something hungry. Martin let out one final whisper, barely audible through the water. They're awake. Then the world went black. When Richard regained consciousness, he was floating near the surface, his lungs burning. A rescue team had pulled him out, but of his crew, only 2 others had survived. The rest were gone. The government wasted no time covering it up. The site was sealed permanently, and Richard was warned never to speak of what had happened. But he didn't need to. The truth haunted him every night. Somewhere beneath Lake Michigan, the ones below had stirred, and they were waiting for the next sacrifice. Richard was never the same after that night. The government could try to erase the truth, but the memories, the horrors he had witnessed were burned into his mind. He barely spoke, barely ate, and when he did sleep, his dreams were filled with visions of Martin's hollow eyes and the shadows shifting beneath the lake. But worst of all, he could still hear them. The whispers started weeks after his return. At first, they were faint, like distant voices carried on the wind, but as the days passed, they grew stronger. He heard them in the stillness of the night, in the silence of an empty room, even in his own thoughts. They weren't just voices, they were calling to him. And he knew exactly where they wanted him to go. Desperate for answers, Richard tracked down the two surviving divers from that night: David, a deep-sea explorer with years of experience, and Lena, an ex-military diver who had seen things the government would never admit to. Both were shaken, haunted by nightmares and an overwhelming sense of dread. But they too had heard the whispers. "We didn't escape," Lena whispered, her hands trembling. "They let us go, but they want us back." Richard knew there was only one way to end this: to return to the lake, alone, and face whatever was waiting for him. He had lost Martin once. He wasn't going to lose him again. With no official equipment, Richard improvised. He acquired stolen sonar maps of the lake, tracking areas that had been marked as restricted. He modified his old diving gear, preparing for deeper, colder waters. And most importantly, he brought something he hadn't before: a weapon. A modified harpoon gun, though he had no idea if it would do any good against whatever lurked in the abyss. On the night of the full moon, Richard returned to the shore where Martin had disappeared. The air was thick with fog, the lake eerily calm. No boats, no animals, not even the sound of waves. As if the entire world was holding its breath. And then, the whispers grew louder. With one final deep breath, Richard stepped into the water. The descent felt endless. The further he went, the colder it became, not just physically, but something deeper. It was as if the water itself was draining the warmth from his body, leaching his very soul. His flashlight flickered, his radio crackled with static, but he kept going. Then, the cave appeared. It was exactly as he remembered: jagged rock formations, eerie carvings, the overwhelming sense that something was watching. But this time, the entrance was open, wider than before. As if the lake was expecting him, he swam inside. The altar was still there, ancient and menacing. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. And then he saw him, Martin, still kneeling before the altar. But something was different. His body was changing. His skin was even more translucent now, his veins dark and branching out like roots. His fingers had elongated slightly, his nails sharp like claws. His eyes, once filled with terror, were now empty. Resigned, he turned his head slowly, as if it took immense effort. His lips parted, and this time, his voice was clearer. "You shouldn't have come." Richard's heart pounded. "I came to bring you home." Martin's expression twisted, not in anger, not in sadness, but something worse: pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I am home." Before Richard could respond, the water around them shifted. The shadows in the cave slithered, moving unnaturally, and then they rose. Shapes began to form, humanoid, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their heads featureless except for gaping, hollow mouths. They moved without swimming, gliding through the water like they were part of it. Richard aimed his harpoon, but Martin grabbed his arm. "It won't help," he said. "They don't want to kill you. They want you to join them." The figures circled closer, their whispering now deafening. The words weren't in any language Richard understood, yet somehow, he felt their meaning. Stay, become, belong. Panic surged through him. He pulled free from Martin's grip, his mind screaming at him to swim, to escape, to get out before it was too late. But Martin didn't move. "Go," he said softly. "Before they decide to keep you too." Tears burned in Richard's eyes. "Martin, go!" The shadows lunged. Richard turned and kicked off the cave floor, propelling himself upward with everything he had. The water resisted, like invisible hands trying to pull him back. He could feel them reaching, grasping. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the water released him. He broke the surface, gasping for air. The sky was still dark, the fog thick, but the whispers were gone. The lake was silent once more. Martin was gone. Richard never spoke of what happened that night. Not to the authorities, not to the surviving divers, not to anyone. He moved away from Michigan. But the lake never left his mind, and then, a year later, it happened. A news report, another diver missing, same location, no body recovered. Richard stared at the screen, his hands gripping the armrest of his chair. He knew it wasn't over, it would never be over. The lake was hungry ... and it was always looking for the next one to take.